Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto. One of my friends is in Port Hope, another one is in Montreal, but we're actually going to Israel and Palestine today. So hold on, hold your hat, because we're off for a big adventure. On Tuesdays, I have what I call schmooze days. That is, these are no agenda conversations where I put 2 or 3 or 4 of my friends together and just see what they come up with. People who probably don't know each other. Sometimes they do, but they may not have much in common. But it's like inviting people to lunch and just hoping that they all get along, and it always works. And today is going to be one of the unusual ones in that I'm really taking a risk, because these guys have the option, if they choose, of talking about stamp collecting or, the anatomy of butterflies. But I think most likely they'll talk about Israel and Palestine, because both of them are Canadians who spend a lot of time in the Middle East, let's say, because one of them is Karen Hamilton, who's in Port Hope. She was, when I met her, she was the head of the Canadian Council of Churches, or the coordinator, or
General Secretary. It's an international position, General Secretary.
All right, that sounds even better. I'd always wanted to be a general secretary of something, and she went on to do things like organize the Parliament of World Religions a couple of years ago in Toronto, and many other good deeds. And she teaches a course in Israel
Israel and Palestine.
Israel and Palestine. Used to be every year, but with COVID, you never know.
Yeah. We shall see.
We shall see. All right. And we have another friend, Canadian person who spends probably even more of his time in Israel/Palestine, mostly Palestine. And this is Abraham Weisfeld, who's in Montreal. And AB is an unusual man. Obviously, from his last name, you can guess that he's Jewish, but he, I think, is more identified with the Palestinians than anybody else right now. At least he's certainly not a Zionist. And he has a different take on what the solution would be for Israel and Palestine. Now, I don't know enough about either of their positions to have any prediction about what they're going to say, or whether they might even conceivably agree about 1 or 2 things. Once in a while it happens. So, but I do want to see what happens when we have this conversation between 2 Canadians who are very familiar with the Middle East. So good morning, Karen.
Good morning.
Wonderful to see you. And AB.
I should introduce myself to Karen Hamilton. I'm a Canadian, just barely. I was conceived in a Jewish refugee camp in the American sector after the Holocaust. And my parents survived by escaping into the Soviet Union and then got out as soon as they could. And I was born in Toronto. So my first language is not even English, it's Yiddish. And my English was rather poor for quite a while, but I turned into a writer anyway.
Superb.
So schmooze is a Yiddish word, of course.
Please, AB, I have never had a proper translation of the word. Yes. So I may have been misusing it all along. Tell me what it officially means.
Well, it means that, you have a friend or friends, sit around in the living room drinking coffee and talking with each other about anything, and it's considered to be a personal interaction and a pleasure. It's considered to be a pleasure.
I have the idea that now it's come to mean something like a meeting with an ulterior purpose. You see somebody that you want to butter up for some, you have some plan or some aspiration of how to use this person. So you're kind of looking for ways to manipulate others. Is that and I don't know whether that's the original meaning at all, but it doesn't sound like you think of it that way at all. Is that right?
No, yeah, that's an English sort of definition of schmooze. it's been sort of transformed.
Okay, well, I promise that I will not manipulate either one of you.
We probably can't be easily manipulated, but I love the Yiddish. I have a Hebrew tutor who is in Israel, so our lessons have to be timed accordingly for 2 time zones. And I had my Hebrew lesson yesterday because my background, and I'll introduce myself a bit more too. My doctorate is in Tanakh, actually, and my biblical Hebrew once upon a time was very good. Now it is less good, but I want to ramp up the spoken Hebrew. As I was saying to Metta before you joined us, I could do Besharat bara Elohim Shemayim Wat Haaretz blah blah blah, but I couldn't say Eifo Hashertim, which is actually a more useful phrase.
What is it?
It means where are the bathrooms?
Oh, okay.
But anyway, she said to me, because I have German as well, she said, "Oh, okay, Yiddish. That's got to be your next language." And I said, "Yeah, okay."
No, you're working on Arabic. How good is your Arabic?
My Arabic is medium. It's hard. Both languages are hard. I also started Ojibwe this month, actually. My Arabic is. I have
language number 9 is Ojibwe.
Yeah, it's language number 9. My Arabic is, it's like a kindergarten level. I can have a great conversation with you if you stick to a very simple vocabulary, and I have some idea what the conversation is about. Sure, I can have basic conversations in Arabic, and I can read basic stuff in Arabic, and this is something that I don't think will be a least bit of a surprise to you, Abby, but Hebrew and Arabic are actually very similar languages. It's easy to get them mixed up. And so people, and I do it all the time actually, but people who think of polarization in the Middle East are often absolutely astounded by that. And a former Hebrew tutor of mine, actually, who was brilliant in Hebrew, didn't actually even know that. And some of my Arabic speaking friends didn't know that either, because there is such potential and sometimes very real polarization that doesn't have to be. I mean, there are difficult issues that cause polarization and that to which there are no easy solutions. But there are also kind of perceptions and pieces of polarization that don't have to be. And one of those is to know that the languages are very, very similar. And so you can easily, in many of the word for pomegranate, for instance, is the same, pretty much the same in both languages. And so like a basic construction, a bit like, it's not as close as Italian and Spanish, I would say. But
now, are you saying that there is so little contact between Arabs or Palestinians and Israelis that they don't even know that their languages are similar?
I would never make a generalization like that. So there's where we want to start about the Middle East. No generalizations. Many Israelis and Palestinians speak both languages and know exactly how close they are. There are also communities there and here in in the West or in other parts of the world that have no idea the languages are related. But there's no such thing. And so I'll kick off with one very short story and then, turn over to you, Abby. But I found out by accident, it was a funny part of my childhood, my growing up, that my father's second, third cousin, whatever, once 14 times removed, and I just found this out in the last 10 years, while I was at the council, actually, when I was General Secretary Metta, I found this out, that her husband was the African, but more pertinent to this conversation, then the Middle East, what's called the desk, the Middle East, there's a phrase in French, responsable, the person responsible for Middle East relations for the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And I just found this out. I've known this guy my whole life, and I just found out what he did. Anyway, so they lived there, and they lived a long time in Israel, Palestine. And so I said to him, Walter, I teach this course there. I've traveled extensively through all of the Arab world and Israel. And I said, so what do you think? Having lived there so long, what do you think some of the issues are, some of the solutions? And he said, Karen, the longer I lived there, the less I knew.
I can believe that.
So,
I mean, I think it's every conversation on the subject is fraught. It's the best way to lose friends that I can imagine. Getting people mad at each other or getting them mad at you by opening your mouth. So there we go. Here we're going to open our mouths. And I don't know what each of you have to say. I do know a little bit about AB's point of view, which I don't want to spend too much time because AB has actually explained it at considerable length in a previous talk show. I know that I don't know, if you take 5 minutes, AB, you can give a quick summary, but it sounded yesterday as if Karen actually already recognizes that point of view and you're not unique in holding it.
I don't mean you're not unique. But please explain it. I'd love to hear more about it. But what Metta just said was a kind of a federalist point of view. And I actually, Metta, you didn't this is how you and I also met, though, was through the World Federalist Movement in Canada, because I've chaired that many, many, many years. So as soon as I heard the word Federalist, I mean, my ears also perked up. So why don't you talk to us about that?
Yeah.
Let me try out some Arabic first. Anti ata alima al Arabia.
Wow. ايوه
تمام
تمام ممتاز ايوه انا اتكلم اللغه العربيه ايوه.
Very good. I'm sure your Arabic is better than mine, because when I was in Nablus, Palestine, I was always working on the computer and writing. In the last over 3 years, because I spent, half the year, during that period, in Nablus, and I wrote a book on the Federation of Palestinian and Hebrew Nations. So, there are indeed, matters of principle involved here, and there are many mistakes being made, because it is what you would call a sui generis condition. This is not like other conditions like South Africa. It's similar to apartheid in South Africa, but it's not the same, because whereas the Afrikaners, were not an oppressed nation to begin with, the Jewish people are an oppressed nation to begin with. And immediately after the Holocaust, it becomes a crucial distinction to be made. And so, there is no, mother country to which the Israelis can return to, unlike Algeria, in which, all the colonial agents, went back to France because they didn't want to live in an independent Algeria. Okay, so it's not like Algeria, it's not like South Africa. So, all of a sudden, then, people have to sort of, begin to analyze it in a way in which generally they're not accustomed to, because people just make parallels and they sort of, go with that. And they think that they've, come to the end of the discussion, but they're nowhere near, like understanding what's going on. And also the definition of nation that I used in the book, is entirely different. It took my entire doctoral thesis to define what I mean by nation, because in the Jewish case, there's something called the people nation, which is not, at all the same as a nation state, that was outlined by in 1648. It's not like, the European concept of a nation state at all. And yet Zionism has adopted the European definition of a nation state and implemented it as a colonial project. And so we have all these problems resulting, whereas previous, to the establishment of the State of Israel and the entry of the Zionist movement there was, of course, coexistence between the Jewish and the Muslim populations. So, and the Jewish, population was Palestinian as well, which was confirmed for me when I went to visit the, Samaritan Museum in Nablus at Mount Gerizim. And they have 3 identity papers. They have, Israeli citizenship. They have the Palestinian, identity number, and they have Jordanian passport as well. So they're in the best of all situations, and when the Samaritans, come down to the market, they dress in their, the older men, they dress in their traditional, Ottoman garb. And, like nobody even looks, like it's considered to be normal, and everybody knows that they're Jewish as well, but it makes no difference to them because they're Palestinians, and that's all that counts, for the Palestinians. And even me, like when I'm introduced as a Jewish, friend of the Palestinians, it's wahalam salam, all the time.
Yeah.
So there's no real problem, between Jewish and Palestinian, Jewish and Arab, peoples per se. The problem is between the political institutions. And so I broke that down and projected the recognition of each nation as a non-territorial nation. Mm-hmm. So this is a people nation. So and this is accommodated in the Resolution 181, even there's a paragraph in there that was pointed out by Dr. Uri Davis, who lives in Ramallah, and he's on the political commission of the Fatah party. He's a member of Fatah, a Jewish member of Fatah, and he's on the political commission. And he points out, in the Resolution 181, which refers to the choice that people would have of being a member of either a Palestinian government or a Jewish government. So there's an option there for a non-territorial solution so that Jewish people and Palestinians can live, wherever, but they choose their political representatives, on the basis of their national identity. And so this allows for a federation to be set up in which there's a federal council in which each government, has equal representation, and they come to an accommodation for each by basically consensus, because they each have, 50-50 representation. And when I projected this, presented this, to the Palestinians in Nablus, which is, a very, politicized city and more radical than Ramallah, everybody agreed. There was no problem there. So it's a matter of breaking the mold of the nation state. But the previous governments, of Israel were hell bent on, solidifying that concept, to the right, to the point of, declaring Israel to be a Jewish nation state, which upset the Druze enormously, because they considered that they were, integrated, into not only the state, but the military as well. Right. And they were volunteers, to defend, the state of Israel. And yet they were, alienated, in that way, by the declaration of Israel as only a Jewish nation state. So it's a completely different subject, when we're talking about the federation, mm-hmm. Rather than, having a nation state per se. Yeah. Yeah. And I totally.
Karen, I'd like to know whether or not what he just said is what you expected, because we talked about yesterday what I kind of thought his views were, and of course I can't represent his views at all, but you seem to think you've heard people with that point of view, and I don't know whether you have or not.
I have, which is not to take away from the how great the idea is at all, but in fact to solidify it and say, there are others who are thinking in these kind of terms. And I was racking my brains when you were talking, Abby, and it's like there's one of the Israeli writers that write, and I just can't think of his name. And unfortunately, because I'm in Port Hope, I don't have all my Middle East books with me. But there is an Israeli writer who writes in these kind of terms as well. And I also wanted to, Metta, and we'll come back to this, but I wanted to just, while I'm remembering them, spin off of 3 other points that were mentioned. And I say this, Abby will know all of this. He'll know this. So this is for the rest of the audience. Okay. So one is that, of course, there are many Christians in the land, fewer than there used to be. But most, not all, but most of them are Palestinian as well. So when we speak about Palestinians, and I've had that exact experience, one of my colleagues is a Palestinian Christian, with whom I work. Another part of what I do is I'm on a board of an incredible organization called Project Rosanna, which it works on Israeli-Palestinian understanding through reconciliation through healthcare and working together on healthcare issues. And it's a brilliant organization. So I encourage everyone to look it up and Google it and support it, of course, Project Rosanna. Anyway, our colleague through Project Rosanna is Palestinian Christian, but if you speak in Arabic, exactly as you said, you greet him in Arabic or start talking about the fact that it was Ramadan or whatever when we were having a meeting, that's very much a part of his context too, because there's that Palestinian Muslim Christian connection. And so that's really important for people to know as well.
Well, let me mention the name Mubarak Awad, because yes. Mubarak Awad is one of the great peacemakers, I think, that I've ever met. He's just one of on my pantheon of saints, and he's Christian. So right. I guess, he certainly belongs in your category of.
Many of the holy sites are shared. So when I teach a course there, we take Jews, Christians, and Muslims to the land. And the first time, our very first experience doing it, which was a decade ago, we would be talking to the imam and say, imam from the West, which will take me to another point, imam from the West. And we said, okay, so we'll go to 1/3 Jewish sites, 1/3 Christian sites. We were a bit naive in those days. 1/3 Jewish sites, 1/3 Christian sites, 1/3 Muslim sites. Well, of course, you can't, because some of the sites are sacred to all three, and some are sacred to two of the traditions, which is delightful. That was and we all, kind of knew that intellectually, but when you're planning an itinerary, you really get down to it in concrete terms. And so it's not like sites just easily belong to one tradition or another, but they have multiple levels of meaning. There's a tomb, and just, throw this in as well. Much of the work and the study and the talk about the Middle East, I just do have to say, is done by men. And yet there are all kinds of really active women's organizations and pieces of the context that are particular. The Women of the Wall, of course, you will know, which we can talk about later too. Conversation is going to go on for days, Metta. But there's a tomb. There's a tomb up on the Mount of Olives, which is holy to all three traditions, because the tradition is that a Jewish woman prophet was buried there, a Christian saint was buried there, a Muslim saint was buried there, a Muslim woman saint, all three women, and one from each tradition. So you see that. But another point I wanted to pick up, though, is you mentioned the Druze, and again, people in the West just don't know about the Druze. It's a whole other faith group. And you're right. How left out did they feel? It's going to be a Jewish state. Well, the Druze have been there. It's an old tradition, and it's been there for centuries and centuries and centuries, millennia.
Did you tell me, or somebody told me yesterday, I don't know, that the Druze speak Aramaic?
I wouldn't have said that. There is a small sect that does. I've been in Syria, actually. I was in Syria until 2 days before the war broke out. And I was in the little village that speaks Aramaic in Syria. They may, I don't know enough, or they may be familiar with it, or they may, I don't know actually the answer to that question.
Maybe it was Amy who told me that, because that's the first time I heard of it. It was yesterday.
That they speak Aramaic? Yes, I didn't know that, so thank you for.
Yes, but only in Syria, not in Israel itself.
There we go. That's why I was confused about the question, and I've heard it in Syria, but I also know well their participation in the Israeli military is, as you say, very, very strong. So let me throw in another factor, though, too, which we haven't talked about, is the influence of the West, whatever the West, however we define that, on what's happening. So, for instance, and this is again, you will know this, but the general public sometimes does not. So when there was conversation between the wars about a Jewish nation, because there was lots of conversation from the 1800s about a Jewish nation. It didn't just kind of magically appear after the absolute horror that was the Shoah. The idea had been out there for a very long time, but of course the genocide that was the Shoah gave it new, rightly so, impetus. But there was talk about Uganda. And so the Western powers had just decided that the Jewish people could all be sent to Uganda, and a new country that could become a Jewish state. Well, of course, for all kinds of reasons, that was not going to work for the Jewish people in terms of history, tradition, and locations. But what did that have to say about the local Ugandans?
Well, my understanding was, I'd heard about this, that there was more wiggle room in Uganda. There was more real empty land that would be
In-
available.
In whose opinion? I mean, that's what happened to the first.
I don't know, but it's an objective question. You could ask
Anyway,
whether it's really true or not. I don't know whether it's true, but at least it's
Well-
something that's answerable.
Well, yes, that proposition was entirely out of context for the Jewish people because it was considered to be a way to get the Jewish people out of the Christian nation states,
right.
out of the West. It was merely a proposition for an expulsion of the Jewish people. And Jewish people didn't want to leave their homelands, which was England, United States, Canada, whatever. They considered themselves to be English, American, and Canadian, and they didn't want to leave their homeland, you know. So, and in fact, the Zionist proposition for a state in Palestine wasn't really all that much supported by the Jewish people. Let me give you two instances, you know, because, you know, my mother was a Jewish Bundist from Warsaw, from the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. The Jewish Bund was established in the same year as the Zionist movement and called for Jewish liberation, as well as the Zionists. You know, the Zionists was a Jewish national movement and the Bund was a Jewish national movement, but they differed in that the Jewish Bund, you know, called for integration, not assimilation, but integration into their homelands of Poland, you know, Russia, Belarus, or whatever, you know. Whereas the Zionists considered that integration was impossible because anti-Semitism was so ingrained, you know, as to be a sort of a genetic factor in the composition of the Western Christian nation states. So they gave up on the West and considered that they had to adopt the same methodology as the nation state and do so in the name of the Jewish people. Whereas the Jewish Bund, you know, called for integration and liberation as a Jewish nation with Jewish national cultural autonomy, with its own government for its internal affairs, but also as a liberation movement in an economic sense, you know, because it was mainly a working class movement, and so was socialist revolutionary movement. Whereas Zionism had no confidence whatsoever in a socialist revolutionary process to liberate the Jewish people. And there was some truth to that, you know, because in Russia, under the Stalinist regime, you know, there was various anti-Semitic purges, and in Poland as well in 1968. So there's some truth to that, you know, because socialism is not a solution in and of itself, you know, to the matter of national liberation. And in fact, national liberation became a very, you know, sensitive point, you know, in Russia. Despite, you know, the Leninist proposition for self-determination, there was never any sort of nation that actually achieved its self-determination under the socialist administration of that time. And the frontiers were merely the frontiers of the old Tsarist Empire. And even a part of Romania was returned to Russia under the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, in which Russia regained, you know, part of the territory that was taken, you know, from the Tsarist Empire and returned to the USSR under Stalin. So, you know, like, it's really complicated. Yeah. And you know, that's why my thesis ended up being 720 pages.
Wow.
You know, because I had one member of my jury, you know, Professor Sami Owen, who was pro-Zionist, pro-two-state solution, but in a Zionist way. Yeah. And he gave me a lot of trouble. He insisted upon major modifications, and after that, minor modifications, which were major modifications, but I never gave in. And he threatened, you know, to tank my thesis until finally, you know, I went to court and got a defense, because he went and actually, you know, like, expelled my thesis in a secret committee meeting, you know, with the director of the thesis committee. I had that problem with him and with the two-state solution. And finally, you know, like, I got a defense, and he chose not to turn up, and so it was passed. But this approach that I have, and the Jewish Bundist, you know, mentality that I have, has gotten me into trouble with not only, you know, the Zionists, not only the two-state proposition people, but also the Marxists, who do not consider Jewish people to be a nation. And they say that the problem with Zionism is that they define Jewish people to be a nation, where the Marxists merely consider it to be a religion. And therefore, it's a religious problem, according to the Marxists. So, and Jewish people know that they are a nation. And so when the Marxists say, you have to give up, the idea of being a nation, and therefore you have to oppose, Israel on the basis that the Jewish people are not a nation, well, that goes nowhere. That argument, has no validity whatsoever.
Amy, I mean, you talk about this concept of nation, and it reminds me of the dispute that was probably most current when Pierre Trudeau was talking about whether or not Francophones are a nation. Mm. And he was clear about saying, a nation is this thing that has a flag and boundaries on the map. That's what a nation is. And all these people talking about a people being a nation, this is nonsense, and it's only getting in the way. It sounds to me as if your definition of a nation would exactly contradict Pierre Trudeau's definition.
Precisely, because the definition of nation is entirely opposed to the liberal definition of a nation, which comes from the Reformation, which is linked with the Protestant religions, which established themselves as a national religion in order to achieve independence. So the model was for a religious justification to declare that given national culture was independent and had a right to be independent, not only because it had a national consciousness, but it had its own religion and its own name, like Lutheranism or Calvinism or Anglicanism or any sort of a model of that which justified and gave a body to the nation state that was established during the Reformation. And that's what the Zionists wanted to do as well.
Let's unpack that, because I think, normally this concept of the nation as a people, it goes back to some sort of, I think, Herder and people like that in Germany with the notion of Geist. A people is like a people is like a person. It's like an entity. It's like it has its own mind, its own motives, its own identity, its own purposes, and it's only one step from there to say it should also have its own land. So if you are a people, you're like one giant person, and you have certain rights, and you should have the right to a homeland. Now, you are making that a distinction. You don't see the homeland as equivalent or a corollary of believing in a nation in that sense at all, as I understand it. But it's not that different, though. They historically and in terms of theory, as far as I know, that's kind of the way they got hooked up together quite early, and certainly had an impact in the world. That certainly is still alive in a way when you talk about nationalism and nationalistic movements of people wanting their own. I've been interested in separatism, states breaking in two so that each ethnic community, which I'd call an ethnic community, you'd call it a people, should have its own territory. Okay. So I've intruded in this conversation.
Well, I was just going to say in Canada, and I know our subject is the Middle East, but in Canada, the United States, and many other countries, we also can't have this conversation about nations without the reality of First Nations, Indigenous peoples, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a crucial part of any conversation about nations. And we use the term First Nations.
Yes. Well, with respect to Trudeau, he was entirely refuted. There was a motion, a law, a resolution that was passed by the House of Commons unanimously declaring Quebec to be a nation. Mm-hmm. Not a nation state, but a nation. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals, as well as the NDP, voted in favor of this proposition as a concession to the Quebecois national consciousness, sort of, to accommodate them within the Canadian Confederation. Confederation is not the same as federation. Confederation is an association of states, like the United States of America. And so it was sort of, conceding, like verbally, that Canada was a confederation in the sense that Quebec would be a nation of its own, and that there was not one nation in Canada, there were two nations in Canada, although not much substance, was fed into that, paradigm. So, the liberal notion of a nation as a nation state is being bypassed, by the course of events, out of necessity. There's another point that I wanted to make previously with respect to the languages. And, the Arabic translators that I met in Nablus, they told me themselves, that Hebrew and Arabic, shared the same vocabulary to the extent of 70%.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the new Hebrew words, are just American words, written with Hebrew characters.
Yeah, yes and no, I would say. Yes and no, but some are.
Okay, that was something else that I assumed myself.
Yeah, some are. Like fax, for instance. Fax is, you can just write it out in Hebrew letters, the sound for, sending someone a fax. But a lot of the Hebrew that has been sort of brought up again since the founding of the State of Israel also has used biblical terms. And so, how do you find a word for electricity? Well, you go back into the Bible and you look for something that's kind of related and use that. So there's a lot of that is done. I've done some study on that and the origins of some of the words that are used in modern Hebrew now. But it's not just the vocabulary, it's like grammar structure. So for instance, this is, you got to be a language geek to appreciate this kind of stuff. So I don't expect anybody to appreciate it other than me. But if you want to make a verb into a noun, both languages put an M on the front. Both languages do that. And, for an English speaker, that just seems so weird when you first encounter it. You're going to turn that verb into a noun by putting an M on the front. Okay. You think of that as an idiosyncrasy of Hebrew. And then I found out that Arabic does exactly the same. When we teach the course at St. George's College in Jerusalem, it is booked for February, Metta. We shall see. But we teach it. It's just north of the Damascus Gate. In a Palestinian part of the outside of the old city. I mean, you can see the old city. It's very, very, very close, 5-minute walk to the old city. But there's also Mea Shearim. It's right close to Mea Shearim, which is a very, very Orthodox Jewish part of the city. And we go to, there's a school. There's a Palestinian school, Palestinian boys' school. So we go and we visit those kids and they tell their stories and they have hard stories to tell about the checkpoints they have to go through to get to school. They're receiving a fabulous education. They are the future. So actually I have 2 stories to go with this. But anyway, one of the things, so we asked them, what would you like? If you could change anything about your education, what would you change? And they said, we had no idea this was coming. They said, we need to learn more Hebrew. And we sort of went, what? You want to learn more Hebrew, knowing that the relationship, can be pretty fraught between Palestinians and Israelis. And they said yes, because it is still, although, officially Arabic is very recognized in Israel, very recognized. And, anybody sort of in position of authority, whatever, is likely to speak Arabic as well, but, or many. Anyway, but they said, but it still is a language of the, sort of the government is Hebrew, and we would do better if our Hebrew was less basic, and we would have sort of more, more ability to compete in society, to rise to positions of leadership if we had more Hebrew. And so, wow, that is really wise and strategic. I mean, sad in a way, but also wise and strategic. They could sort of see their future. But another story, not from the school, but from talking to younger people in Israel and Palestine. And one of the things they will say, I have heard frequently, is that in order to make any progress, whether it's towards a federal model or a 2-state solution, to make any progress, all the leadership has to go. All sides, Hamas, Fatah, Israel. There's got to be a new generation, and there is not going to be any substantive progress until there is an entirely new generation on all accounts. And I've heard that also over and over again. How that's going to happen, we'll see, because some of the Palestinian leaders that Palestinians would lift up as future leaders are in jail for things that the Israeli government has not liked. It's complicated, but that needs to be said. So I'll tell a third story is there's an organization, which again, I'm sure called Family Circle. And Family Circle brings together, Israelis.
Yes.
I think you do. Yeah, just by a different name. They bring together Israelis and Palestinians who have had family members killed in conflict. And the last night of one of my courses, everybody's tired because we just run them ragged because there is so much to see and so much to listen to and so much to do. The last night we had Family Circle come, and the Jewish speaker had his daughter blown up in a bus in central Jerusalem during the Second Intifada. The Palestinian speaker had his daughter shot by an Israeli sniper. So they had both lost their daughters to the violence as young girls. So, tragic beyond tragic. And as the leaders of the course, because I teach a course with a rabbi and with an imam, we sort of looked at ourselves and said, what are we doing having this on the last night? It is just so painful. And, everyone's going to cry and just be filled with a sense of despair and hopelessness over the violence in the land. Everybody did cry. We were right. But in the evaluations, people said, and these are, Westerners, Canadians, North Americans, folk from Britain. We've also actually had folk from Tanzania come, and Australia, New Zealand. But they said, you know what? That was the most hope-filled evening that we had, because these two guys who have gone through unimaginable pain and horror are friends, and they stand side by side and they tell their stories and they support each other. And if that is possible, anything is possible. It's a lovely story. And there's a new book out that tells their story. And I can never pronounce the title quite correctly, but it's Operagonon. Anyway, there's a new book out that tells their story, actually, and it's got very good reviews. Anyway, but the question then comes down to, though, that's wonderful and hope-filled and aspirational and inspirational and all those things, but then you see this goes back to your federalist model, how to make it happen.
That's what my book is about. Because you have to start somewhere, and a proposition, for a solution with, when you're talking about the end game, is completely idealist, and it has no dynamic to it, and will not happen, as such. So I started off, with the mutual recognition of each state, Palestine and Israel. Okay. Because that's, the only, place to go.
Yeah.
Like to talk about a one-state solution, as Ilan Pappé does, et cetera, means nothing, because the powers that be, will not allow it to be. And if they say, that it is already a one state, that's, just playing with terms. So we have to begin with the recognition of Palestine, because Israel is already recognized. Israel is recognized by the PLO in the negotiations that took place. Unilaterally, they recognized, the state of Israel, and they were negotiating with it. But Israel did not recognize the state of Palestine, even though they call it a two-state solution. So, I raised this matter with the American ambassador, Dennis Ross, last week in a webinar. And I said to him, why is it that the proponents of a two-state solution have recognized the state of Palestine, but they refuse to recognize the state of Palestine? No, they recognize the state of Israel, but they refuse to recognize the state of Palestine. And he replied, facetiously, oh, well, the partition plan, recognized, in 1949 resolution of the General Assembly recognized, Israel as a state. And I said, yes, but based upon partition resolution, there was a frontier set to that state, which was, bypassed by the Zionist militias. And, what was recognized as the state of Israel is not at all clear. And secondly, if Israel is recognized, then why cannot Palestine be recognized as well as a state? And then he said, well, there's the Clinton parameters. These are the conditions for the recognition of the Palestine state. And I said, oh, well, if there's preconditions for the recognition of the state of Palestine, how come there's no preconditions for the recognition of the state of Israel, like international human rights law? And then he referred to the partition resolution, and then I countered by saying that Israel violated that partition resolution, and then he didn't say anything. And I just left it. And my final comment was, "And you know that," and then he had nothing left to say. So, that's the problem right now, is the non-recognition of the state of Palestine. Not that the PA administration is adequate to the task.
Right. And that needs to be very clearly said. Yes.
Yes. And there has to be elections. Now, on the other hand, there's a PA. The PLO on the international level is doing the diplomatic work, which is representative of not only the PA, but also of Hamas. Hamas recognizes the role of the PLO in international diplomacy. And Hamas has also changed its charter. They dropped the old charter of 1988, which was anti-Semitic, and citing the protocols of the Elders of Zion and everything. The new charter does not refer to Jewish people as the enemy. They refer to the Zionist state as the enemy or the problem, and Zionism, and they don't have any anti-Semitic content anymore. Now, I don't know if
that would be that would be depending on who's defining it, because many would say that to refer to Zionism as an enemy is anti-Semitic. But anyway, keep going. But that's yeah.
Okay.
It's good that if anybody doesn't know, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the most horrific anti-Semitic forgery.
Yes.
Which is still believed in. Yes. Anti-Semitic, and that really needs to be said, that in the scope of this conversation too. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. It is horrific in the world. It is back. It never went away. Yeah. But it is the persecution of Jewish folk in countries all around the world is horrific. Islamophobia is very real. We know that too. But the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are still this horrific anti-Semitic forgery is still very much adhered to by some.
Yeah, by the populist mentality, which tries to infiltrate into leftist movements as well, and tries to turn them into a populist, phenomenon. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yes, and that's important for people to know too, that there's a lot of really good analysis being done right now around anti-Semitism on the left.
Yes.
There are some that think that somehow anti-Semitism only exists in right-wing conservatism, but there is lots of anti-Semitism in left-wing theories and politics, and that needs to be recognized. And I think it's something like we really in the West are turning a blind eye to this.
Yes,
and I haven't seen that, Karen.
Yes, you're very good. Thank you for mentioning that. And I'd like to point out that this is a historic reality. In 1903, in the Congress, International Congress of the Second International, the Jewish Bund was excluded because they maintained their Jewish identity.
Right.
They weren't allowed to represent Jewish workers because Jewish workers were supposed to be represented by the party that was the national party of the nation state in which they found themselves.
Right.
And so the Bund was excluded. And this was, supported by both Lenin and the Mensheviks and the Social Democrats, and this is still the basic position of the Marxist movement, in these days. And it's terrible, This is one reason why I got expelled from the Independent Jewish Voices of Canada, when I insisted upon, not falling into an anti-Semitic, verbiage, when they wanted to support a petition that referred to the 2008, I think it was, attack on Gaza as a Holocaust. I said, excuse me, I know what a Holocaust is. That's not a Holocaust. You can call it a massacre. You can call it genocidal. But please, if you call it a Holocaust, that means you don't know what a Holocaust is.
Right.
And that you are trivializing the Holocaust and denying, what the Holocaust was and is. Yeah. And they expelled me. They gave me 10 minutes to talk on a telephone, and that was it. I was out.
Yeah.
And the Marxist movement, has this central flaw which they refuse to recognize, and it's terrible, and it's.
I'm having trouble with this because I'm not very Marxist. I've never been Marxist, so I don't know my way around the Marxist organizations, but I really don't see them as anti-Semitic, and I just don't get it. When you say that, what I think you're saying is they're opposed, many of them, as I am, oppose a hell of a lot of Israel's policies. And being opposed to Israel's policies, if that's anti-Semitic, then hell, I don't know, maybe I am.
Well, the trouble, and this is hard, Metta, and some of us, both of us, no doubt, have been having these conversations for decades, and there is a line. This is a very simplistic way to put it. There is a line that gets crossed, and it gets crossed a lot. And so, for instance, you will hear, back to our conversation about nation, you will hear people say that the Jewish people, like for the Jewish people, Jewish, and I'm a Christian, so why am I even having this conversation? So correct me when I'm wrong, but the relationship between people, God, and land is an inextricable one and cannot be defined by this sort of Western, as you pointed out, this sort of Western Protestant definition of a nation. But you will hear that on the left to sort of say, well, you know, comments that and I'm going to give you a very specific example, but comments that are saying, you know, it's got to be like the definition of a nation, and that the Jewish religion has to be separate from the land. Well, it just isn't that way in Judaism, and so that's a beginning that is anti-Semitic, because we are putting our concept. I'm a Protestant, concept of what a nation is on another people. And
yes.
Well, but that's not unique to Judaism. For heaven's sake, it may be part of Judaism, but it sure isn't. It sure isn't unique. I mean, that's where Nazism got involved. We need our own land because we're a people, and we are, the blood and the soil and the land and the religion and all this stuff is one big thing. You can't distinguish them. I'm not even happy with AB's thing about nations, or maybe yours too. I'm very nervous when people start talking about nations as being some sort of entity that you have to belong to a nation, or you are belonging to a nation whether you like it or not because of who you got born from. I don't like that. I really like to mush up the boundaries between these.
That's a great political term.
I am a very globalistic kind of person. I'm a citizen of 2 countries, and I'd like to be a citizen of about 20 countries.
Well, that would be a great topic for another show.
But it does reflect identity. Once you start thinking in terms of, I'm a world citizen. I am not an ethnic person. Thank you.
So I know our time is coming to an end. So I think to make this a little more concrete for people, because we're ending on what is a very difficult conversation. This whole conversation is difficult, but this concept of anti-Semitism on the left. But so here's an example. I had a phone call a few years ago, but a phone call from a woman who in the United Church of Canada, that's my denomination, who was absolutely clear that, about the oppression of Palestinians by Israel, and how one-sided the situation was. And she, went on and on about this, and, it's all Israel's fault. And, woe is the poor Palestinians. And I mean, there's a huge amount that can be unpacked in that, but I want to get to the end of the story. And so she said, of course, Israel just has to give all the land back to the Palestinians, right of return, all this stuff, right? And the land was taken from all these Palestinian folk, and so the land's all got to be given back. And I said to her, now you understand that Toronto is built on First Nations, Indigenous land. So are you suggesting then, of course, the integrity to your position would be that Toronto has to be given back to the Anishinaabe and the other peoples to whom it belonged and from whom it was taken? And she said, oh, no, that's different. And I said, now, but why is that different? Why is that different? And she also said, and so this is someone who would consider herself very much on the left. The other thing that was really interesting, and here's where, again, I certainly see anti-Semitism, is she talked about the 67 and the 73 wars in the Middle East. And she laid all of the blame on Israel. And how dare the Israelis, and I mean, there are military questions in this too. That's another conversation, but how dare the Israelis have good military equipment? And, you know, how dare the Israelis fight back when somebody was the other nations in Egypt and Jordan and Syria, et cetera, depending on the war. But when they were either attacking Israel or going to attack Israel, how dare Israel fight back? And that, and as I said, setting aside the military question about whether anybody should have weapons, that's another question. But that's a hugely anti-Semitic position. And because she's doing what and people will also talk about, people will push back on that kind of thing and say it's a double standard. Israel is also being held to a standard that is different than other countries are held to. Should all countries be held to a high standard? Of course, we all want that. But should Israel be held to a different standard than other countries?
Well, I guess you and I
need to clarify.
Agree, but
I need to clarify a very important point here, because a lot of the problems, like that have been conducive, to the redevelopment of anti-Semitism, is because the Zionist movement claims to represent the Jewish people.
Right.
Okay. This is not the case.
Right.
Only 45% of the Jewish people actually live in Israel. Everybody thinks that it's a majority of the Jewish people who live in Israel. 45% only. The other 55% don't want to live in Israel, and therefore, by definition, are non-Zionist. Secondly, in 45, when the Jewish refugees were looking for a place to go from the refugee camps, like my parents, my father had a sister who was a Canadian citizen, and so she sponsored my family to come to Toronto. But 48% of the Jewish refugees did not have a relative in the United States or Canada or anywhere else. So they couldn't get sponsorship, and they couldn't get a visa to come into the United States and Canada, because Canada and the United States didn't want to have Jewish socialist refugees coming into their country.
None is too many. None is too many. The name of
That's
the
book
by the Canadian author, Irving Abel.
So
None is too many.
the only place they could go to was Palestine.
Right.
Even though they were not Zionists themselves. Then the second wave of Jewish Arabs, who thought that they would have a better life in Israel than under the discriminatory policies of the Dhimmi Ottoman designation for the Jewish people in the Arab countries, discriminated against the Jewish people there. And so they thought they would have a freer life in Israel. And so they went. That was the second wave. Then a third wave of Jewish refugees, from the Soviet Union, who were refuseniks, and who wanted to go, to Germany, United States, whatever. But Israel asked Germany to close the border to the Jewish refuseniks. And they ended up, having the only place to go was, again, Israel. So this is how, the Jewish people have been manipulated into, populating, Palestine, and therefore giving credence, to the Zionist claim that they're representative of the Jewish people.
But I also
that's
know
not the case.
I know many Zionists who believe in absolute justice for the Palestinian people and the Jewish people, and two-state solution or a federal solution. There are also lots of Zionists who believe in that passionately.
Yes. Yeah. So in Israel itself, the Jewish Israelis are split half-half.
I'm going to seize on Karen's only hopeful statement. I know lots of nice Zionists.
No. I would never say it that way, though, Metta. It's not about being nice. It's about people striving for justice and equality. And there's a great quote in the book of Isaiah, the book of the prophet Isaiah, that says, "And everyone beneath their vine and fig tree, and let no one be afraid."
All right. That's a good conclusion, because I've been trying to find a happy ending to this, what not really wasn't that bad a conversation. I think it went pretty well. I appreciate it very much. I learned a few things, and I would disagree with half of what you guys have said, but then that's another occasion for another talk show.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Thank you both very much.
Yeah, difficult topic indeed.
Good
All
to meet
right.
you, Karen, and thank you again, Metta.